an expansion, and then a job after about 2010, then a decline. And so there's some of my, so I've got all these figures and that I'm not going to show you. There's my map. I just want to show you briefly, and I'll just explain. Halifax, which is the capital of Nova Scotia, is here, and here are all the call centers. And there was a specific cycle to it, which was the call centers went for the downtown locations, well served with public transit, and lots of in Halifax University and college students that are available to pull in. There's all the companies. And then the next place they headed to when they used all that labor up is they moved to the suburbs. And the suburbs of Halifax on both sides, and they set up there. And then more reluctantly, they start moving out and expanding. This is the old industrial hub in Cape Breton, so they went in there and then took more rural locations. And this pattern I saw in Asia as well. And in Asia, they actually grade the labor. They start talking about 1A labor and 1B labor and 2C labor in terms of education and what they call labor quality. So they start in the center, and the expansion goes out, and then mostly it contracts back in a similar way. That's what I looked at, except for some outliers that for me were really curious. And so I'll go on, and so there we go, out. I've got a nice little convergence. This is an outlier, kind of interesting one. This I'll quickly show you. My main point of this slide is that although you talk in Nova Scotia now or Maritimes, people will say it's dead. It's actually still larger than the traditional industries, forestry, fishing, and mining. Still more people employed in business services in 2015. So what explains the contractions and what explains the movements? And what explains particularly the loss of jobs? The loss of jobs was in the really big sites. So the American companies that were coming in and saying to governments, we want to put 2,000 workers in here. One of the largest only ever got up to 1,700. They couldn't recruit more than 1,700 workers in a site. So they failed to achieve the targets that were set out to them, and then that site is no longer there. So I divide call centers into three groups: small, medium, and large. Small are 50 up to 50 seats or less. Medium, 100 to 200. Large to super large, 1,000 plus. My basic line of what we kept and what we lost: we kept a lot of the local, domestic Canadian companies were more likely to be kept. If you're going to shift globally, you don't bother if you've only got 20 workers. We lost the great big operations, and we lost them to, and I went into the Philippines and I met some of the folks who actually had started in the, managers anyway, they don't move the low-end workers, and who were in the Philippines. We lost by and large the big operations, and we kept some of the mid-level ones, and and so labor cost is important. And I think also at the beginning, when they first moved to Canada and the operations were setting up, there were no Asian competitors. After 2000, Asia comes online in a really big way in this industry, and the competition now is extremely fierce and extremely sophisticated, particularly in India and the Philippines in terms of the management of operations. So he's going to tell me to stop. So what I'm going to say, I'll just tell you my conclusions. I think the Americans experimented with us a little bit in terms of being a first location outside of the US to get used to, we have a different currency and funny accents, and we're slightly different kind of a different legislative environment. And at a certain point, the big operations in certain industries, especially telecommunications and some of the lower end, basically some of our minimum wage operations have left. So I think they experimented to see what kinds of operations worked here and could be supported and what couldn't. And we were rejected as a site for large telecommunications and outsourcers. Downtown's still good. Rural areas in small places where there's a deep labor pool survived, more or less. And some of the badly managed operations, well, they didn't survive. My own part of the story is compared to what I saw in Asia, the Canadian governments, they never really got on top of what this industry was about. And some of those operations that moved into locations where public transit, I mean, you've got to get workers to work, and that's sort of a basic thing. Some of the operations that opened with promises that infrastructure would be put in, we're still sitting there a year and a half later with groups of workers who are dumped out at the end of the night and there's no bus. So public transit was a problem. There were other problems too. And here's for resistance what I'm going to finish off and say. What I didn't hear, and I have interviewed hundreds of call center workers, and I didn't hear them initiating conversations about the unions a whole lot. In terms of how do I improve my lot in life, where do I see my future, their own labor resistance when they were not happy in workplaces was if things are good, then move down the street. And there was lots of this, especially in India. When I was there, things were really opening up. But that was also in the Maritimes when things were good, people were aware that there were opportunities. And in fact, companies in India were poaching other companies. Like they would take not just an individual worker, but they were coming in and making offers of whole teams. So that was definitely good. Again, in India, a lot of the youth are used to trying to, there are people coming out of really deep unemployment. And so immigration out of the country entirely has been part of the strategy, but many of them, especially in the large multinationals, seeing that I've got this experience here, I know exactly I could be earning considerably more if I could get to Canada or Australia or the UK. So right out of the country. And the other possibility is right out of the region. The bust is you're back down the value chain. And so for Maritimes, there was a big shift out of hospitality into call centers when the hospitality industry, the bed and breakfast and the restaurants were busy screaming. And but when the call centers came in, of course, when they leave again, well, people have two strategies back. So I would say in terms of worker resistance, the strategies have been very individualistic. And the other strategy that I didn't put there, a lot of these people are young, and so education and moving right out of this industry into something else is part of the path. And this is my very last thing I'm going to say. I followed a cycle, expansion and contraction. We are right back now with the U.S. economy down to 3.7% unemployment. This is exactly, except it's actually worse in the U.S. in terms of labor and shortage than it was when this whole cycle started back in Canada. And when I started interviewing in Nova Scotia, I remember being told, we're here because if we're in Philadelphia, we're taking people out of the homeless shelter and they aren't working out really well in our call center. And I remember being kind of insulted, thinking, oh, so our Canadian university grads, you know, that's how you're making the comparison to your American workers. But nevertheless, so we're back at a cycle, and so what's going to happen now? Well, it's all of our guests. So I will apologize to the next speakers for talking too much and let you